Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that most history books either skipped entirely or buried in a footnote so small you'd need a magnifying glass and a grudge to find it. We're stepping into a chapter of American history so extraordinary, so defiant, and so deliberately forgotten that the fact you're hearing about it at all feels like a small act of rebellion. Tonight, we're talking about the first black politicians who changed the South, not in some distant, symbolic, passive way. These were men who walked into state houses that had been built by enslaved labor, sat in chairs still warm from the Confederates who just vacated them, and started writing laws, real laws, laws about schools and roads and voting rights and land ownership, laws that terrified the old order so deeply that an entire campaign of murder, fraud, and constitutional sabotage was launched to undo every single thing they built. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm especially curious tonight. Drop a comment telling me if you ever learned about Reconstruction in school, and if so, whether they mentioned any of the people we're about to meet, or whether your textbook just sort of skipped from Lincoln's assassination straight to Jim Crow, like nothing happened in between. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, get yourself settled, maybe pull a blanket up to your chin, because what we're walking into tonight involves cold courtrooms, colder politics, and courage that will warm you from the inside out. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to cast a vote for the first time in your life, knowing that the man you were voting for looked like you? What did it feel like to walk into a state capitol as a legislator when, just 5 years earlier, you couldn't legally read a book? What happened when formerly enslaved men started writing constitutions? Did they tremble? Did they hesitate? Or did they walk in like they'd been waiting their entire lives for this exact moment? How does a man who was once legally classified as property stand on a Senate floor and argue for the rights of every citizen in the Republic? What does it cost to hold power when the people who lost it are willing to kill to get it back? And what happens to a revolution when the rest of the country decides it's had enough of progress? Congratulations. You've just woken up somewhere in the deep South, and the year is 1868. The war is over, the Confederacy is dead, and for the first time in the entire history of this land, black men are not only free, they're about to govern. Welcome to the most radical, most dangerous, and most deliberately erased political experiment in American history. The air smells different now. That's the first thing you notice. Not because the magnolias stopped blooming or the river changed course, but because something in the atmosphere has shifted. It's the smell of possibility mixed with gunpowder, and you can't always tell which one is winning. You're standing in a small town in Mississippi, or maybe South Carolina, or maybe Louisiana. The geography matters less than the feeling, which is universal across the post-war South. Everything is both brand new and barely standing. The plantation houses still tower over the landscape, but their owners look diminished now, thinner, angrier, like men who've lost a war and haven't yet figured out what that means for breakfast. You, however, are standing a little taller than you were 5 years ago. 5 years ago, you were property. Your name was whatever someone else decided to call you. Your labor was someone else's wealth. Your children were someone else's investment. But the war came, and the war ended, and the 13th Amendment said what everyone already knew in their bones, but nobody with power wanted to admit. You are a person, a full, complete, undeniable person. And now, for the first time, the government of the United States is going to ask you a question it has never asked you before. It's going to ask who you want to represent you. Here's the thing about that question that the history books don't emphasize enough. The question itself was an earthquake. The entire Southern political system, the entire Southern economy, the entire Southern way of life had been built on the premise that you were not a person, that you could not think, could not reason, could not govern, that you needed to be managed like livestock with more complicated emotions. And now, suddenly, the federal government was saying, not only can you vote, but you can hold office, you can write laws, you can sit in the same chambers where they once debated whether you had a soul. Imagine the sheer audacity of that. Not your audacity, theirs. The audacity of a government that had allowed slavery for nearly 2.5 centuries, suddenly declaring that the people it had enslaved were now qualified to run things. It wasn't generosity, it was political math. The Republican Party needed black votes to maintain power in the South, and the only way to get those votes was to let black men participate fully in the democratic process. The motives were mixed, as motives always are. But the result was something genuinely revolutionary. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts, and those acts did something extraordinary. They divided the former Confederate states into 5 military districts, placed them under federal oversight, and required them to write new state constitutions. But here's the catch that made everything different. Those constitutions had to be written with the participation of black men, and they had to include universal male suffrage, not just for white men, for all men. That's right. The United States Congress, in the year 1867, decided that the South would not be allowed back into the Union until it let black people help design the government. That sound you hear is the entire former Confederacy having a collective aneurysm, and almost overnight, everything changed. Black men began registering to vote in numbers that stunned everyone, including themselves. In states like Mississippi, South Carolina, and Louisiana, where black people were close to or exceeded half the population, the voter rolls transformed. In Mississippi alone, over 67,000 black men registered in 1867. In Louisiana, black voters outnumbered white voters by a margin that made the old planter class physically ill. And these weren't just voters. These were voters who showed up, who organized, who understood, with a clarity born of 2.5 centuries of bondage, exactly what was at stake. The Union League became the organizing engine of this new political reality. Picture it like this. In every black church, in every freedmen's school, in every barbershop and meeting hall across the South, Union League chapters sprang up like wildflowers after a fire. They taught newly freed men how to vote, how elections worked, what the candidates stood for, what the stakes were. They met in secret sometimes, because the Klan was already forming in the shadows, already burning, already murdering, but they met anyway. The church served as the nerve center of black political life, and the preachers who led those churches became, almost inevitably, the first generation of black political leaders. Think about that for a moment. The same institution that had sustained black people through slavery, that had given them a language of hope and resistance when everything else was stripped away, was now producing politicians. Ministers who had memorized scripture because they couldn't read it were now learning parliamentary procedure. Men who had led congregations in song were now leading constitutional conventions. The church didn't just produce voters. It produced governors, senators, congressmen, sheriffs, tax assessors, school board members, and justices of the peace. And it did so with an efficiency that would have impressed any political machine in the country. By 1868, the South was holding constitutional conventions that looked nothing like anything anyone had seen before. In South Carolina, where black people made up the majority of the population, the convention included 76 black delegates, 76 men, many of them formerly enslaved, sitting in a room writing the laws that would govern a state. Some had been born free in the North. Some had purchased their own freedom. Some had escaped slavery and served in the Union Army. Some had been field hands 6 years earlier. And they were all, every single one of them, doing something that no one in power had ever intended for them to do. The constitutions they wrote were remarkable, not because they were radical by modern standards, but because they were radical by the standards of 1868 America. South Carolina's new constitution established the state's first public school system. Think about that. Before Reconstruction, South Carolina had no free public education for anyone, black or white. The formerly enslaved men who wrote that constitution created something that benefited the entire state, including the children of the same white planters who despised them. They also abolished debtors' prison, expanded property rights for women, and created a more equitable tax system. They wrote a constitution so thoroughly modern that parts of it remained in effect for over a century. And it wasn't just South Carolina. Across the South, these new constitutions were quietly revolutionary. Mississippi's convention included 17 black delegates who helped draft provisions for public education and universal male suffrage. Louisiana's convention went even further, writing protections for racial equality in public, accommodations and transportation directly into the state constitution, decades before the rest of the country would even pretend to care about such things. But here's the thing about writing a constitution. It's just paper until someone enforces it. And enforcement required something that had never existed before in the American South. It required black men in positions of actual power, not symbolic power, not figurehead power. Real, day-to-day, sign the law, collect the taxes, run the school board power. And that's exactly what happened next. In the elections that followed these conventions, black men won office at every level of government. They became sheriffs and mayors and county commissioners. They became state legislators and state senators. They became lieutenant governors and secretaries of state. In Mississippi, a state that had been among the most vicious defenders of slavery, a free-born black minister named Hiram Revels was elected to the United States Senate. Not just any Senate seat. The very seat that Jefferson Davis had occupied before he left to lead the Confederacy. If irony were a food, this would be the richest meal in American history. Let's pause on that for a moment, because the weight of it deserves its own silence. Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America, the man who went to war to preserve slavery. His Senate seat was now occupied by a black man, Hiram Rhodes Revels, born free in Fayetteville, North Carolina in 1827, educated at seminaries in Indiana and Ohio, an ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a chaplain to black troops during the Civil War, a man who had spent his entire life preparing for a moment that no one could have predicted would arrive. Revels arrived in Washington in February 1870, and the Senate gallery was packed. People had come from across the city to witness something that had never happened in the 94-year history of the Republic. A black man was about to take his seat in the United States Senate. The galleries burst into applause when he entered the chamber. Southern Democrats predictably tried to stop it. They argued that the Dred Scott decision, which had declared that black people were not citizens, meant that Revels hadn't been a citizen for the required 9 years. The argument was both legally absurd and morally bankrupt, which made it a perfect summary of everything the opposition stood for. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner dispatched the objection with a single sentence that landed like a gavel. The time for argument, he said, had passed. And so Hiram Revels raised his right hand and took the oath. And somewhere, in whatever corner of the afterlife Jefferson Davis occupied, a man who had committed treason in defense of slavery heard the news that a black preacher from North Carolina was sitting in his chair. Congratulations, Jeff. History has a sense of humor, and tonight it's laughing in your direction. But Revels wasn't alone. 5 years after him, Mississippi sent another black man to the Senate, Blanche Kelso Bruce. And Bruce's story is, if anything, even more astonishing than Revels, because Blanche Bruce wasn't born free. He was born into slavery in 1841 in Prince Edward County, Virginia. His father was his enslaver, a white planter named Pettis Perkinson, who treated the boy comparatively well and even had him educated alongside his legitimate white children. When the war came, Bruce escaped to Missouri, taught school briefly, then made his way to Mississippi after the war ended. What happened next reads like the biography of a man who had decided that the entire concept of limitation was a suggestion he planned to ignore. Bruce bought land in the Mississippi Delta. He became a planter himself, eventually owning thousands of acres. He was appointed registrar of voters, then tax assessor. He won election as sheriff of Bolivar County. He became tax collector, supervisor of education, and editor of a local newspaper. All of this in a state where 10 years earlier, he would have been legally classified as property. In 1874, the Mississippi State Legislature elected Bruce to the United States Senate. He served a full 6-year term, the first black man in American history to do so. He presided over the Senate itself in 1879, the first black person to hold the gavel in that chamber. He tried to desegregate the U.S. Army. He demanded an investigation when a black cadet at West Point was brutally hazed. He opposed the Chinese Exclusion Act because he understood, perhaps better than anyone in that chamber, what it meant when a government decided that an entire group of people didn't deserve to be treated as human. And at the 1880 Republican National Convention, Bruce received 8 votes for Vice President of the United States, the first black American to receive votes for national office at a major party convention. Picture him for a moment. A man born enslaved in Virginia, standing in the United States Senate in a black suit and a starched white cotton shirt, a 14-karat gold pocket watch chain visible against his black waistcoat. His colleagues from Mississippi, white men who 10 years earlier wouldn't have shared a sidewalk with him, filing through his office with their problems and requests because he was their senator, and that's what senators do. A Pennsylvania Republican visited Bruce's office and was stunned to find a waiting room full of white Mississippians, all there to see the black senator. The visitor later confessed he'd assumed all white Southerners hated black people on principle. Bruce's very existence was an education, but the Senate wasn't the only place where black political power was reshaping the South. In fact, the most dramatic transformation was happening at the state and local level, where roughly 2,000 black Americans held public office during Reconstruction. That number alone should stop you in your tracks. 2,000. Not 2. Not 20. 2,000 black office holders in a region that, a decade earlier, had classified them as chattel. They served as school board commissioners, county commissioners, clerks of court, city council members, justices of the peace, constables, coroners, magistrates, sheriffs, auditors, and registrars. in South Carolina, black men at one point made up a majority of the state House of Representatives. In Louisiana, black men served as lieutenant governor, secretary of state, and superintendent of education simultaneously. And then there was PBS Pinchback. If Reconstruction had a leading man, a protagonist so improbable that a Hollywood screenwriter would be accused of making him up, it was Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback. Born in 1837 in Macon, Georgia, to a white Mississippi planter and a formerly enslaved woman, Pinchback was light-skinned enough to pass as white. He never did. His father sent him to school in Cincinnati, but when his father died, the boy was just 11, and his white relatives tried to re-enslave his family. His mother fled with her children to Ohio, and by the age of 12, Pinchback was working on riverboats to support them. When the Civil War broke out, Pinchback ran the Confederate blockade on the Mississippi to reach Union-held New Orleans. There, he recruited black soldiers for the Corps d'Afrique, eventually becoming captain of Company A in the 2nd Louisiana Native Guard. He resigned over unequal pay and discriminatory promotions because even while fighting for liberation, the Union Army couldn't quite bring itself to treat black officers as equals. After the war, Pinchback threw himself into Louisiana politics with the energy of a man who'd been waiting his entire life for the world to catch up with his ambitions. He founded the 4th Ward Republican Club in New Orleans. He served as a delegate to Louisiana's 1868 Constitutional Convention, where he wrote the provision guaranteeing racial equality in public transportation and public businesses. He was elected to the Louisiana State Senate, where he introduced bills to establish Southern University, a black college. A political rival tried to assassinate him. He survived. He became president pro tempore of the state senate, then lieutenant governor when the incumbent died, and then, in December of 1872, acting governor of Louisiana. Governor of Louisiana, a black man, in 1872. Let that land. This was barely 7 years after the end of slavery. The son of a formerly enslaved woman was running one of the most politically volatile states in the country. He served for 35 days, during which 10 acts of legislature became law. He made over 100 appointments. He outmaneuvered white supremacists who were trying to overthrow the state government by force. He was a newspaper publisher, a gambler, an orator, a speculator, and, according to one historian, a dandy. He was also the only black governor of any American state during Reconstruction, and wouldn't be followed by another until Douglas Wilder won Virginia's governorship in 1989. That's a gap of over a century. After his time as governor, the Louisiana legislature elected Pinchback to the United States Senate. He waited 3 years to be seated, 3 years, during which the Senate Committee on Privileges and Elections debated whether Louisiana's government was even legitimate enough to send a senator. The committee eventually acknowledged that Pinchback likely would have won a fair election, but by then the political winds had shifted, Democrats had gained power, and the Senate voted against seating him. They offered him $16,000 in back pay and mileage as compensation, which is the 19th century equivalent of being told your promotion has been cancelled. But here's a gift card. Pinchback's story alone could fill an entire evening, but he was just one thread in a tapestry so dense with improbable black achievement that it's a wonder the whole thing hasn't been turned into a 12-part prestige television series. Actually, it's not a wonder. It's a deliberate erasure. But we'll get to that. Let's talk about South Carolina, because if any state embodied both the promise and the peril of Reconstruction, it was the Palmetto State. South Carolina had been the first state to secede from the Union. It was the state where the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter. It was a state where the enslaved population had outnumbered the white population for generations. And when Reconstruction came, South Carolina became the stage for the most dramatic experiment in biracial democracy the country had ever seen. The man who best embodied that experiment was Robert Smalls. And if you don't know the name Robert Smalls, that's not your fault. It's the fault of every textbook that decided a man who stole a Confederate warship, delivered it to the Union Navy, served 5 terms in the United States Congress, and wrote South Carolina's first public school law wasn't interesting enough to mention. Robert Smalls was born enslaved in Beaufort, South Carolina, in 1839. His mother, Lydia Polite, worked in the house of their enslaver, Henry McKee, but she made a deliberate choice to show her son the full brutality of slavery. She took him to watch the field hands being whipped. She wanted him to understand what the system was, not just the comparatively sheltered version of it he experienced inside the big house. It worked. Young Robert grew defiant, got into enough trouble that McKee sent him to Charleston at the age of 12 to be hired out as a laborer. In Charleston, Smalls worked the waterfront. He became a lamplighter, then a stevedore foreman, then a rigger, then a sailor. He learned every channel, every sandbar, every current along the South Carolina and Georgia coasts. He married a woman named Hannah Jones, who was also enslaved, and they had children together. He started saving money to buy his family's freedom, $800 that would take years to earn, at the meager wages left over after his enslaver took his cut. Then the war came, and Robert Smalls stopped saving money and started making history. In 1862, Smalls was forced to serve as the pilot of the CSS Planter, a Confederate military transport ship operating out of Charleston Harbor. He steered it through the harbor, laid mines, delivered dispatches and troops. He knew the Confederate signal codes. He knew the harbor's defenses. He knew exactly where every Union blockade ship was positioned, 7 miles out in the open water. And one night in May of 1862, while the white officers of the Planter were ashore, breaking regulations by sleeping in their own beds instead of on the ship, Robert Smalls put on the captain's coat and hat, fired up the boiler, and sailed the CSS Planter right past the Confederate forts. He gave the correct signal at each checkpoint. He picked up his family and the families of his fellow enslaved crewmen from a prearranged meeting point. And then he steered that ship straight to the Union fleet, lowered the Confederate flag, raised a white bedsheet, and delivered a fully armed Confederate military vessel, complete with cannons and intelligence about harbor defenses, to the United States Navy. He was 23 years old. The Union went wild. Smalls was an instant celebrity. He traveled to Washington, where he met President Lincoln and helped convince him to allow black men to enlist in the Union Army. He was given command of the Planter itself, becoming the first black captain of a vessel in United States service. He served the Union Navy for the remainder of the war, seeing combat, surviving a direct hit that nearly sank his ship, and earning respect that would follow him into peacetime. After the war, Smalls went home to Beaufort, and the first thing he did was buy his former enslaver's house, the very house where he'd been born, the house behind which his mother's cabin had stood. Federal authorities had seized it for unpaid taxes during the war, and Smalls purchased it at auction. When the former enslaver's wife, elderly and impoverished, later needed a place to live, Smalls let her move back into her own former home. He let the woman who had owned his mother live under his roof. That's not weakness. That's a kind of strength that most people can barely comprehend. From Beaufort, Smalls launched a political career that would span more than 2 decades. He was a delegate to the 1868 South Carolina Constitutional Convention, where he championed the public school provisions that made South Carolina the first state in the nation to mandate free, compulsory public education. He served in the State House of Representatives, then the State Senate. In 1874, the people of Beaufort sent him to the United States Congress. And this is where the story of Reconstruction's black politicians begins to darken, because for every gain these men made, the backlash was building. And the backlash was not polite disagreement. It was not spirited debate. It was organized, systematic, murderous violence. Let's talk about what it actually felt like to be a black politician in the Reconstruction South. Because the textbooks that do mention these men tend to list their achievements as if they happened in a vacuum, as if winning an election was the hard part, and everything after was smooth sailing. The truth is that every day in office was an act of survival. Joseph Rainey knew this better than most. Rainey was born into slavery in Georgetown, South Carolina, in 1832. His father, a barber, eventually purchased the family's freedom. Young Joseph followed his father into the barbering trade, working at the fashionable Mills House Hotel in Charleston, where he cut the hair of the very men who would soon try to destroy the country over their right to own people like him. When the war came, Confederate authorities conscripted Rainey to build fortifications around Charleston. He and his wife escaped on a blockade runner to Bermuda, where they spent the war years building a small business and waiting for the world to change. When the war ended, Rainey came home. He threw himself into politics, serving as a delegate to the 1868 South Carolina Constitutional Convention and winning a seat in the state Senate. In 1870, when a sitting congressman was unseated for fraud, a special election was held, and Joseph Rainey was elected to the United States House of Representatives. On December 12, 1870, he walked into the House chamber and took the oath of office, becoming the first black man ever to serve in the United States House of Representatives. The gallery was packed. Newspapers across the country reported on the moment. Reporters described how every member of the House turned to watch as Rainey raised his hand. His first major speech came in April 1871, and it was about survival, literal survival. Across the South, the Ku Klux Klan was waging a campaign of terror against black voters, black office holders, and anyone, black or white, who supported Reconstruction. Rainey stood on the floor of Congress and argued for federal troops to be deployed against the Klan. He told his colleagues something that they did not want to hear, and that many of them probably could not fully comprehend. He told them that when he and his black colleagues left the halls of Congress and turned their footsteps toward their southern homes, they did not know whether the assassin would be waiting for them. They were, he said, marked for his vengeance. He was not exaggerating. In October 1868, just months after South Carolina's new biracial legislature took office, Benjamin Randolph, a black state senator and colleague of Rainey's, was shot dead while changing trains at a railway station in Hodges, South Carolina. 3 white men fired the shots. They rode away on horseback. The murder happened in broad daylight with witnesses. No one was ever arrested. Democratic newspapers had described Randolph as a persistent advocate of social equality, which was apparently an offense punishable by death. Rainey himself received death threats. In May of 1871, a letter arrived decorated with a skull and crossbones drawn in red ink. It read, "Your doom is sealed in blood." It demanded that he and other black officials leave South Carolina or face execution. Rainey forwarded the letter to a newspaper and vowed to remain, declaring that he and his allies would sell their lives dear as the price of liberty and manhood. And he stayed. He stayed for 4 terms, the longest-serving black congressman of the Reconstruction era. He fought for the Civil Rights Act of 1875. He fought for the rights of immigrants, of workers, of Native Americans. He was the first black man to preside over the House of Representatives, overseeing debate in 1874. And throughout it all, he carried the knowledge that any trip home might be his last. This was the daily reality for black politicians throughout the Reconstruction South. The threat of violence wasn't abstract. It was specific, personal, and relentless. At least 35 black office holders were murdered during the Reconstruction era by the Klan and other white supremacist organizations. Hundreds more were beaten, threatened, or jailed. In Georgia, 1/4 of the state's black legislators were killed, threatened, beaten, or imprisoned. In Louisiana, the violence was so pervasive that elections functioned less as democratic exercises and more as controlled battlefields. The Colfax Massacre of 1873 stands as one of the most horrifying examples. In Grant Parish, Louisiana, a disputed election led to a confrontation between black Republicans and white Democrats. On Easter Sunday, a white paramilitary force attacked the courthouse where black men had gathered to defend the results of the election. When the battle ended, somewhere between 60 and 150 black men were dead, many of them executed after they had already surrendered. The perpetrators treated it as a celebration. They posed for photographs. Federal authorities eventually brought charges, but the Supreme Court gutted the convictions, ruling that the 14th Amendment did not give the federal government the power to protect individuals from violence by other individuals. Only states could do that. And the states, of course, had no intention of doing so. This was the environment in which black politicians operated. Every vote cast was an act of courage. Every speech delivered was a dare. Every law written was a provocation to men who believed that the natural order of the universe required black people to be subordinate, silent, and invisible. And yet they kept going. The sheer volume of what these men accomplished in barely a decade, while under constant threat of death, is staggering. They established public school systems across the South, in states that had never had them. They built roads, bridges, and railroads. They reformed tax systems that had protected the wealthy at the expense of everyone else. They expanded property rights. They created courts that, for the first time, treated black testimony as legally valid. They funded orphanages and hospitals. They wrote constitutions so progressive that white Democrats would spend the next century trying to destroy them. In South Carolina alone, the Reconstruction legislature accomplished things that seem almost impossible given the circumstances. They created the state's first public school system, the first divorce law, the first provisions for the rights of women. They funded infrastructure improvements that benefited everyone in the state. They abolished corporal punishment. They reformed the penal system. And they did all of this while being mocked in the press, threatened by the Klan, and undermined at every turn by Democrats who referred to the era as Negro misrule. That phrase, Negro misrule, deserves its own moment of examination because it became the dominant narrative of Reconstruction for nearly a century. The story white Southerners told, and that white historians amplified, was that Reconstruction was a disaster, that illiterate, incompetent former slaves had been manipulated by greedy northern carpetbaggers into stealing power and ruining the South. that the legislatures were circuses of corruption and incompetence, that the only way to save civilization was to restore white rule. This narrative was a lie, a deliberate, carefully constructed, politically useful lie. Yes, there was corruption during Reconstruction. There was also corruption in every other state government in the country during the Gilded Age. The difference was that nobody used corruption in New York's Tammany Hall as evidence that white people were unfit to govern. The corruption of Reconstruction was real, but unremarkable by the standards of its time. What was remarkable was the excuse it provided for ending democracy in the South. The truth is that Reconstruction's black politicians were, on the whole, thoughtful, effective, and deeply committed to the public good. Many were ministers. Many were self-educated, having taught themselves to read in secret during slavery. Many had served in the Union Army. They came from every background imaginable. Some had been born free in the North. Some had purchased their own freedom. Some had been field hands. Some had been skilled artisans. What united them was not their backgrounds but their ambition, not for themselves alone, but for the communities they represented. Robert Brown Eliot was one of them. Born in England to West Indian parents, possibly in Liverpool, Eliot was educated, eloquent, and fearless. He served 2 terms in the United States House of Representatives from South Carolina, and in 1874 delivered one of the most celebrated speeches in congressional history, an impassioned argument in favor of the Civil Rights Act that moved even some of his opponents. He quoted constitutional law, English common law, and the Declaration of Independence. He argued that the nation could not claim to be a land of liberty while denying liberty to millions of its citizens based solely on the color of their skin. The speech was reprinted in newspapers across the country. Prints of Eliot delivering it were sold by the thousands. He was 31 years old. Then there was John Roy Lynch of Mississippi. Born enslaved in Louisiana in 1847, Lynch was freed by the Union Army and settled in Natchez, Mississippi. He was largely self-taught, having picked up reading by listening through the wall of a white schoolroom. By the age of 22, he was elected to the Mississippi State Legislature. By 25, he was Speaker of the Mississippi House of Representatives. By 26, he was elected to the United States Congress. He served 3 terms and later became the first black man to deliver the keynote address at a Republican National Convention. He went on to become an attorney, a military officer in the Spanish-American War, and an author who spent his later years correcting the lies that white historians had told about Reconstruction. Lynch's autobiography, published in 1913, was one of the first works to challenge the prevailing narrative of Reconstruction as a period of chaos and incompetence. He wrote from first-hand experience, having been there, having governed, having watched, as everything he and his colleagues had built was systematically dismantled by men who preferred tyranny to democracy. His work was largely ignored for decades, overshadowed by the racist mythology that had become the accepted history. Let's look more closely at the mechanics of how these constitutional conventions actually operated, because the image of formerly enslaved men drafting a state constitution is extraordinary, and the reality was even more remarkable than the image suggests. When South Carolina's Constitutional Convention convened in January 1868, it met in Charleston's Club House, a building that had recently hosted some of the most elegant gatherings in Confederate society. The delegates arrived from every corner of the state, many of them traveling for days to reach Charleston. The black delegates included men of staggering variety. Francis Cardozo, the son of a free black woman and a Jewish businessman, had been educated in Scotland and London. He would go on to become South Carolina's Secretary of State and then State Treasurer, making him one of the highest-ranking black officials in the country. Jonathan Jasper Wright, born free in Pennsylvania, was an attorney who would become the first black person to serve on a state Supreme Court when he was elected to the South Carolina Supreme Court in 1870. Alongside these educated, worldly men sat delegates who had been picking cotton in the fields a few years earlier, men who couldn't write their names, but who understood justice with a clarity that years of formal education sometimes obscures. Men who knew exactly what they wanted because they had spent their lives being denied it. They wanted schools, they wanted land, they wanted the right to testify in court, they wanted their marriages recognized as legal, they wanted their children protected, they wanted to be treated as human beings, and they intended to write that requirement into law. The convention lasted 53 days. The debates were vigorous, sometimes heated, always consequential. When the subject of education came up, delegate after delegate rose to speak about the transformative power of learning. Men who had been punished for literacy argued with passionate eloquence for universal public education. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. The men who the old order had declared incapable of learning were now designing a school system. When the subject of suffrage came up, there was a debate that might surprise modern readers. Some black delegates argued for disenfranchising former Confederates permanently. Others, including many who had been personally victimized by the slave system, argued for a more inclusive approach. They reasoned that a democracy that excluded people based on their past actions was not truly a democracy. This was not naivety, it was principle. And it was a principle that many of the white men in the room, had the situation been reversed, would not have extended in return. The Constitution that emerged from this convention was, by the standards of its time, one of the most progressive governing documents in the Western world. It established universal male suffrage without property requirements. It created a public school system. It reformed the courts. It expanded the rights of women, including married women's property rights. It abolished imprisonment for debt. It provided for local elections of officials who had previously been appointed. It was, in every meaningful sense, a democratic revolution codified in law, and similar scenes played out across the South. In Mississippi, where 17 black delegates participated in the Constitutional Convention, the new Constitution established public schools and eliminated property qualifications for voting. In Louisiana, the Constitution went further still, writing prohibitions against racial discrimination directly into the state's fundamental law. These weren't minor adjustments to existing frameworks. They were wholesale reimaginations of what Southern governments could and should be. The white press treated these conventions with a mixture of horror and contempt. Reporters for Democratic newspapers described the proceedings in language calculated to humiliate. They mocked the clothing of black delegates, their speech patterns, their mannerisms. They treated the conventions as performances of absurdity rather than exercises in democracy. And for nearly a century, those mockeries were accepted as historical truth. The image of Reconstruction's constitutional conventions as circuses of ignorance was seared into the American consciousness by a press that could not accept the legitimacy of black governance. The reality was the opposite. These conventions produced constitutions so sound that their basic frameworks remained in effect long after Reconstruction ended. Even the white democratic governments that overthrew Reconstruction kept many of the structural reforms. They kept the public school systems, albeit segregated and unequally funded. They kept many of the judicial reforms. they kept the expanded franchise, which they then constricted through poll taxes and literacy tests rather than formal repeal. The architecture was too good to tear down completely. They just locked certain people out of the building. Let's also consider the role that black women played in this political moment, because even though they could not vote or hold office, their contribution was indispensable and too often invisible. Black women organized. They raised funds. They cooked the meals at political gatherings. They sewed the banners. They taught in the schools that black legislators established. They nursed the sick and cared for the orphaned. They confronted white employers and white neighbors and white officials with a courage that matched anything displayed by the men who held titles. At Republican rallies across the South, black women were often the majority of the crowd. They brought their children. They brought food to share. They sang. They cheered. They heckled opponents. They created an atmosphere of community and purpose that energized the men who would cast the ballots. Without them, the political revolution of Reconstruction would not have been possible. The votes were cast by men. The movement was built by everyone. Some black women took more direct roles. Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who had been the first black woman to publish a newspaper in North America, became a tireless advocate for suffrage and civil rights during and after Reconstruction. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper traveled the South lecturing on temperance, education, and civil rights, reaching audiences of thousands. Harriet Tubman, whose wartime service had earned her a reputation that transcended race and gender, remained active in community organizing and advocacy for women's suffrage. These women understood that the fight for black political power and the fight for women's political power were parts of the same struggle, even when the men leading Reconstruction didn't always see it that way. The interplay between gender and race during Reconstruction created tensions that would reverberate for decades. The 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race, did not include sex. Some women's suffrage advocates, most notably Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, opposed the amendment because it did not enfranchise women, and some of their arguments were disturbingly racist, suggesting that it was outrageous to give black men the vote before educated white women. Black women found themselves caught between two movements, supporting racial justice and demanding gender equality, and too often being asked to choose. But within the black community itself, women's contributions to the political project of Reconstruction were recognized and valued, even if they weren't always formally acknowledged. The church, the school, the mutual aid society, the household itself. These were the institutions that women ran, and these were the institutions that made black political power possible. Every black legislator who cast a vote had been educated, fed, clothed, supported, and sustained by women who understood exactly what was at stake and who gave everything they had to the cause. And yet, despite all of this, despite the constitutions and the schools and the churches and the women who built the movement and the men who served in it, the story that most Americans learned about Reconstruction was a lie, and the mythology was powerful. For generations, the story of Reconstruction was told through the lens of white grievance. The 1915 film Birth of a Nation, which glorified the Ku Klux Klan and depicted black legislators as buffoons and predators, was screened at the White House by President Woodrow Wilson, who reportedly said it was like writing history with lightning. The Dunning School of Historians, based at Columbia University, produced an entire generation of scholarship that treated Reconstruction as a tragedy, not because democracy was destroyed, but because it had been briefly extended to people they considered unworthy of it. It took until 1935 for a serious counter-narrative to emerge, when W.E.B. Du Bois published Black Reconstruction in America, a massive, meticulously researched work that reframed the entire era from the perspective of the people who actually lived it. Du Bois argued that Reconstruction was not a failure of democracy, but a triumph that was murdered in its crib by white supremacist violence. His book was largely ignored by the white academic establishment for decades, but it planted a seed that would eventually grow into a complete revision of how American history understood the period. Here's the thing about Reconstruction that the silence is designed to hide. It worked. For a brief, shining, imperfect, extraordinary decade, democracy in the South worked. Black men voted, held office, wrote laws, built institutions, and governed effectively. The South didn't collapse. The economy didn't implode. Civilization didn't end. What happened was that white supremacists decided they'd rather destroy democracy than share it, and eventually the rest of the country decided to let them. The end came gradually, and then all at once. The mechanism was called redemption, which is a word that tells you everything you need to know about how white Southerners viewed the process. They were redeeming the South from the sin of black political participation. The tools of redemption were violence, fraud, and law. The violence came first. In Mississippi, the so-called Mississippi Plan of 1875 laid out the strategy with chilling clarity. White paramilitary organizations, openly affiliated with the Democratic Party, launched a coordinated campaign of terror across the state. They disrupted Republican rallies. They assassinated black leaders. They stationed armed men at polling places and turned away black voters at gunpoint. They stuffed ballot boxes. They burned registration records. When Republican Governor Adelbert Ames begged the federal government for military assistance, President Grant's Attorney General told him the public was tired of the annual autumnal outbreaks in the South. Tired. A generation of black voters was being terrorized out of existence, and Washington was tired. The Mississippi Plan worked so well that other southern states adopted it immediately. In South Carolina, the Red Shirts, a paramilitary group led by former Confederate General Wade Hampton, rode through the countryside breaking up Republican meetings and threatening black voters. In the 1876 election, fraud was so brazen that in one South Carolina county, the number of votes cast for Hampton exceeded the total number of registered voters in the county by 2,000. Democrats took control of the state government. Federal troops withdrew. Reconstruction was over. What followed was a systematic, state-by-state dismantling of everything that black politicians had built. New constitutions were written with the explicit purpose of disenfranchising black voters. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and understanding clauses were designed with surgical precision to prevent black men from voting while preserving the franchise for illiterate white men. The mechanisms were transparent in their purpose. At Mississippi's 1890 Constitutional Convention, one delegate openly declared that the convention's goal was to eliminate the menace of black political participation. No one pretended otherwise. They just had to be clever about the language. Robert Smalls was there. At the 1895 South Carolina Constitutional Convention, the same Robert Smalls who had stolen a Confederate warship served 5 terms in Congress and written the state's first public school law, stood before a room full of Democrats and fought against the new Constitution that was designed to strip every black citizen in the state of their right to vote. He and 5 other black delegates were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and ultimately overruled. The new Constitution was adopted, and South Carolina's black citizens were effectively disenfranchised for the next 7 decades. Smalls refused to accept it quietly. He and his colleagues wrote an article for the New York World, trying to publicize the injustice. But the country had moved on. The North was busy industrializing. The Republican Party had made its peace with white supremacy. Nobody was coming to help. The last black congressman of the Reconstruction era was George Henry White of North Carolina. He was elected in 1896 and re-elected in 1898. His term expired in 1901. In his final speech to Congress, White acknowledged that this was the last time a black man would speak from the House floor for the foreseeable future. He was right. It would be 28 years before another black person served in Congress, and 72 years before another black person represented a southern state. Think about that timeline. From 1901 to 1973. 72 years of silence. An entire lifetime during which no black voice was heard in Congress from the region where black people had once governed. The men who had written constitutions, built schools, fought the Klan, and served their communities with extraordinary courage were erased from history so thoroughly that for generations, most Americans had no idea they had ever existed. And while they were being erased from the history books, they were also being erased from life. The Reconstruction politicians who survived the violence aged into a world that was actively dismantling their legacy. Robert Smalls served as collector of the port of Beaufort until 1913, a federal patronage appointment that kept him in public life even as the state government stripped away every right he had fought for. He died in 1915, in the house he had purchased from his former enslaver, in a state that no longer allowed black people to vote. PBS Pinchback survived until 1921, living long enough to see the rise of Jim Crow, the proliferation of lynching, and the complete reversal of everything his generation had accomplished. Blanche Bruce died in 1898, just as the new constitutions were completing the work of disenfranchisement. Joseph Rainey, the first black congressman, died in 1887 in poverty, having spent his last years trying unsuccessfully to start a banking business. The cruelty of their endings should not obscure the magnificence of what they achieved. In a decade, these men demonstrated that black Americans were not only capable of governing, but were often better at it than the men who had governed before them. They built public school systems from nothing. They wrote constitutions that expanded rights for everyone. They served in the face of violence that would have broken lesser people. And they did it not because they were saints or superheroes, but because they were ordinary people who had been given an extraordinary opportunity and refused to waste it. Let's spend a moment inside the world they built, because it deserves to be felt, not just catalogued. Imagine you're a freedman in South Carolina in 1870. You're maybe 30 years old. You were born on a rice plantation near Beaufort, and you have spent every day of your life until 5 years ago working in water up to your waist, planting and harvesting rice in the same low-country marshes where your parents and their parents had labored before you. You know the smell of mud and salt and sweat. You know the sound of the driver's horn before dawn. You know the ache of labor that has no endpoint, no weekend, no vacation, no retirement. You know what it means to have your children taken from you, sold like furniture to pay someone else's debts. But now it's 1870, and things have changed in ways that sometimes feel like a dream you're afraid to trust. There's a school in your town, a real school with a teacher, often a young woman from the north who came down to teach freed people. Your children go to that school. Your children are learning to read and write. Your children, who under the old order would have been punished for touching a book are sitting in a classroom with slates and chalk, sounding out words that open doors to every room in the world. There's a church, too, not a secret gathering in the woods or the back of someone's cabin, but a real church with walls and a roof, and a congregation that sings on Sunday morning with a freedom that vibrates through the floorboards. The minister is also a politician. He serves on the county commission. He helped write the state's new constitution. When he preaches about deliverance, he means it in the most literal sense. He knows what it means to be delivered because he has been delivered, and he helped deliver others. You voted last month. You stood in line with other men, black and white, and you marked a ballot, and you placed it in a box, and you participated in the governance of the place where you live. Nobody had to explain to you why that mattered. You already knew. You'd spent your whole life watching other people make decisions about your body, your labor, your family, your future. And now, for the first time, you got to make a decision of your own. You voted for a black man who sits in the state legislature. He's fighting for land reform, for fair wages, for school funding. He's one of you. And he's in the room where the laws are made. The market is busier than it used to be. Black merchants are opening shops. Black tradesmen are working for themselves instead of for an enslaver who keeps all the profit. There's a barbershop run by a man who cuts hair and talks politics in the same breath. And half the customers are there as much for the conversation as for the haircut. There's a sense of possibility that hangs in the air like honeysuckle, sweet and slightly intoxicating. It doesn't erase the past. It doesn't undo the scars. But it offers something that the old order never could. It offers a future. This was Reconstruction, not the disaster that white historians described, not the circus that the democratic press mocked, but a fragile, genuine, beautiful attempt to build a democracy that included everyone. It was imperfect. It was messy. It was sometimes corrupt, as all democracies are, but it was real. And the men who built it were real. And the fact that it was destroyed doesn't diminish what it was. It only deepens the tragedy of what was lost. The church played a role in all of this that cannot be overstated. Before Reconstruction, the black church was the only institution that enslaved people controlled. It was where they gathered, where they mourned, where they celebrated, where they planned. During Reconstruction, the church became the foundation of black political life. 24 of Georgia's black legislators were ministers. Across the South, churches served as meeting halls, voter registration sites, schools, and campaign headquarters. The connection between spiritual leadership and political leadership was so intimate that they were often indistinguishable. Hiram Revels was a minister. Henry McNeil Turner, who organized the black Republican vote in Georgia more effectively than anyone else in the state, was a minister. Richard Allen, Tunis Campbell, scores of others, men who had led their congregations through the darkest years of slavery, now led them into the bright, terrifying uncertainty of freedom. They brought to politics the same skills they had honed in the pulpit: the ability to move people with words, the ability to organize and mobilize, the ability to hold a community together when everything around it was falling apart. And the women, who could not yet vote or hold office themselves, were the engine that powered the entire operation. Black women organized church events, raised funds, mobilized voters, and served as the backbone of the Republican infrastructure in the South. They couldn't cast ballots, but they could and did shape the political landscape through sheer force of will. The history of Reconstruction's black politicians is incomplete without acknowledging the women who made their elections possible. Let's walk through the mechanics of what it took to vote in the Reconstruction South, because the act of casting a ballot was not the simple, taken-for-granted civic ritual we think of today. For a black man in Mississippi or South Carolina in 1868, voting was a pilgrimage. It involved walking miles, sometimes dozens of miles, to a polling place. It involved passing through territory controlled by men who wanted you dead. It involved standing in line for hours, sometimes exposed to the weather, sometimes exposed to armed men who loitered near the polls with rifles and bad intentions. The Union League prepared men for this. They taught them which candidates to vote for. They explained the issues. They rehearsed the process, because most of these men had never been inside a government building for any purpose other than being sold. They created a political culture from nothing, a culture of participation, of responsibility, of ownership over the democratic process. And they did it so effectively that black voter turnout in the Reconstruction South was often higher than white voter turnout. These were not passive people being herded to the polls. These were engaged, informed citizens who understood exactly what they were fighting for. The polling places themselves were often churches or schools, spaces that the black community controlled. Inside, poll workers, sometimes black, sometimes white, handled the ballots. Outside, the tension was palpable. Everyone knew that every election was a contest not just between candidates, but between two visions of what America was supposed to be. One vision included black people as full citizens. The other did not. And on election day, those two visions collided at the ballot box with a force that sometimes ended in gunfire. Consider what it meant for a former slaveholder to watch his former property walk past him to vote. Consider the psychological impact of that. For the slaveholder, the entire world had been inverted. The hierarchies that had structured his life, his identity, his sense of himself, had been demolished. He didn't see a citizen exercising a constitutional right. He saw an abomination. He saw the end of civilization, and he was willing to kill to restore it. This is the context in which Reconstruction's black politicians operated. Not in some abstract political arena where debate was civil and disagreements were resolved through polite negotiation, but in a war zone where the ballot was a weapon and every election was a battle and every black man who ran for office was a soldier. Let's take a step back now and talk about something that rarely gets discussed when people talk about Reconstruction's black politicians. Let's talk about what they wore, what they ate, how they traveled, how they spent their evenings, because the humanity of these men lives in the details, and the details have been buried just as thoroughly as the politics. When Blanche Bruce arrived in Washington to take his Senate seat in 1875, he was 34 years old and impeccably dressed. A black suit, tailored to fit, a starched white cotton shirt, a waistcoat with a gold pocket watch chain. His hair was dark and wavy, his beard trimmed in the Van Dyke style that was fashionable at the time. He looked, by all accounts, like exactly what he was. A man of substance, a man of education, a man who belonged. The Washington press corps, which had expected something else, was visibly surprised. One reporter noted that Bruce carried himself with the ease of someone who had been in politics his entire life, which, given that his entire political career had been compressed into about 6 years, was a remarkable observation. Bruce took rooms at a boarding house when he first arrived, but he quickly moved into more comfortable quarters. He entertained regularly. He attended the opera. He dined with senators, diplomats, and business leaders. He married Josephine Wilson, a woman of such refinement and social skill that Washington Society columnists could barely contain themselves. Their wedding, in Cleveland in 1878 was covered by newspapers across the country. The guest list included senators, congressmen, and prominent figures from both races. Their honeymoon in Europe lasted 4 months. This was not what the enemies of Reconstruction wanted people to picture when they thought of black legislators. The caricatures in the Democratic press depicted them as barefoot, illiterate buffoons, incapable of operating a government and interested only in stealing from it. The reality, as Bruce's life demonstrated, was something quite different. These were men who, given the opportunity, moved through the corridors of power with competence and dignity. They wrote legislation. They negotiated compromises. They built coalitions. They represented their constituents. They did the job. The food they ate tells its own story. In Washington, black legislators dined at the best restaurants that would serve them, which in the 1870s meant a limited but growing number of establishments. George T. Downing, a black restaurateur and civil rights activist, ran the House of Representatives dining room from 1868 to 1876, and his kitchen served some of the finest meals in the capital. Back home in the South, the food was different. It was the food of the communities these men represented. Cornbread and greens and sweet potatoes and rice. Smoked ham and fried fish and beans cooked slow over a wood fire. The food of black Southern culture, rooted in West African culinary traditions that had survived the Middle Passage and 2.5 centuries of slavery and emerged, somehow, as one of America's great cuisines. At boarding houses in Columbia and Jackson and Baton Rouge, black legislators gathered over meals that tasted like home and talked about the future. The conversations ranged from the mundane to the monumental. Who was going to chair the education committee? Whether the tax assessment was fair in the western counties? Whether the militia budget would pass? Whether it was safe to travel the Greenville Road after dark? These were the rhythms of political life, no different in kind from the conversations that white legislators had been having for decades, just different in the fact that the people having them had been property a few years earlier. The travel itself was an ordeal. Getting to and from the state capital, or from the South to Washington, was a journey fraught with indignity and danger. On trains, black legislators were routinely refused first-class seating, even when they had purchased first-class tickets. They were shunted to smoking cars, to freight cars, to cars designated for colored passengers that were invariably older, dirtier, and less comfortable. Joseph Rainey described being physically ejected from a whites-only dining room in a Washington hotel. Robert Brown Elliott was turned away from restaurants in the nation's capital. These were men who made the laws of the land, and they couldn't eat where they pleased or sit where they'd paid to sit. The indignities of travel extended to lodging. In many cities, hotels refused black guests outright. When black legislators traveled to attend sessions, they often stayed in the homes of black families or in boarding houses run by black proprietors. This created its own kind of community, a network of homes and businesses that served as an informal infrastructure for black political life. But it also reinforced the reality that even in places where black men held power, the broader society treated them as less than equal. And then there was the matter of personal safety. Every black politician in the Reconstruction South carried the awareness of physical danger as a constant companion. Some carried guns. Some traveled in groups. Some varied their routes and schedules to avoid ambush. The threats were not hypothetical. They were specific, named, and dated. Threatening letters arrived regularly, many written in red ink, many adorned with skulls and crossbones. many signed by the Ku Klux Klan or its successors. Some were crude, some were disturbingly eloquent. All carried the same message: leave or die. The psychological toll of this constant threat is something that historians have only recently begun to examine. Living under perpetual surveillance by people who want you dead does things to a person. It changes the way you sleep, the way you eat, the way you hold your body in public spaces. It makes you hypervigilant. It exhausts you. And yet these men continue to function, continue to legislate, continue to show up. The mental toughness required for this is extraordinary, and it's worth pausing to acknowledge that these were not mythical figures with superhuman resilience. They were people. They were tired. They were scared sometimes, and they did it anyway. Let's talk for a moment about what was happening in the churches, because the political and the spiritual were woven together so tightly during this period that separating them misses the essential truth of how black political power operated. On any given Sunday morning in the Reconstruction South, a black church was not just a house of worship. It was a town hall, a school, a courthouse, a campaign headquarters, and a community center, all wrapped in the rhythms of hymns and scripture. The morning would begin with singing. Spirituals that had carried enslaved people through the darkest nights now carried freed people into the brightest mornings. The songs hadn't changed, the context had. When a congregation sang about crossing the Jordan, they weren't just singing about the afterlife anymore. They were singing about the river between slavery and citizenship, and they had crossed it. The preacher would deliver a sermon that was simultaneously about salvation and suffrage, about the kingdom of heaven and the county commission. He would weave together the story of Moses and Pharaoh with the story of the latest voting registration drive. He would invoke the prophets to justify the demand for public schools. He would move between the spiritual and the political so seamlessly that the congregation wouldn't even notice the transition, because for them there was no transition. Justice was justice. Freedom was freedom. And the God who had delivered them from slavery was the same God who would sustain them through the long fight for equality. After the service, the churchyard would fill with conversation. Women who couldn't vote would discuss which candidates to support and organize their communities to get men to the polls. Older men would share news from the county seat. Young men would talk about the Union League meetings scheduled for Tuesday night. Children would play between the headstones in the church cemetery, oblivious to the weight of what the adults were discussing, which was nothing less than the shape of their future. This was the ecosystem that produced Reconstruction's black politicians. Not a political machine in the traditional sense, but something more organic, more rooted, more resilient. A network of churches and schools and barbershops and mutual aid societies that functioned as the circulatory system of black political life. When a candidate needed supporters, the church provided them. When a community needed information, the church distributed it. When a family needed protection, the church organized it. The institution that had sustained black people through the worst of American history was now powering the best of it. And the schools. We keep coming back to the schools because the black politicians of Reconstruction kept coming back to them. Education was, for this generation, the master key that unlocked every other door. They had lived in a world where literacy was a crime for black people, where teaching an enslaved person to read could get you fined or imprisoned, where ignorance was deliberately maintained as a tool of control. And so, when they had the power to build schools, they built schools with a fervor that bordered on the religious. The schools they built were humble by modern standards, one-room buildings often constructed by the community itself, with hand-hewn benches and donated books and teachers who were barely older than their students. But they were temples. Every child who walked through the door was an act of defiance. Every lesson was a revolution. Every word a child learned to read was a word that could never be taken back. Many of the teachers were women from the north, sent by missionary organizations to educate the newly freed. Others were black women from the South itself, women who had learned to read in secret during slavery and now shared that dangerous, beautiful knowledge openly. The classrooms were crowded, whole families sometimes enrolled together, parents sitting beside children, grandparents beside grandchildren, everyone learning the alphabet at the same time. The desire for education was so intense that it overwhelmed every logistical challenge. There weren't enough teachers, there weren't enough books, there weren't enough buildings, but there were always enough students. Reconstruction's black politicians understood that schools were not just about reading and writing. They were about creating citizens. A person who can read a ballot can vote intelligently. A person who can read a contract can protect themselves from exploitation. A person who can read a newspaper can participate in public discourse. A person who can read the Constitution can demand that its promises be kept. Education was not a luxury. It was a weapon, and the men who funded it, fought for it, and wrote it into law knew exactly what they were arming their communities with. The numbers tell the story. Before Reconstruction, Southern states spent almost nothing on public education. By the early 1870s, Reconstruction legislatures had created school systems that served hundreds of thousands of children, both black and white. South Carolina's Constitution of 1868, written in significant part by formerly enslaved men, mandated free public education for all children between the ages of 6 and 16. This was more progressive than many northern states at the time. The men who had been denied education were now guaranteeing it for every child in the state, regardless of race. Think about the audacity of that. Men who had been punished for learning to read were now writing laws that required the state to teach every child. Men whose enslavers had justified their bondage by calling them ignorant were now building the infrastructure to eliminate ignorance. There is a poetic justice in this that no amount of historical revisionism can diminish. And while the schools were being built, something else was happening that rarely makes it into the history books. Black communities were building entire parallel economies. In towns across the South, black entrepreneurs opened shops, restaurants, barbershops, tailoring businesses, blacksmith operations, and print shops. Black mutual aid societies provided insurance and financial support to their members. Black benevolent associations cared for widows and orphans. The economic foundation of black political power wasn't just votes. It was dollars invested in community institutions that created independence from the white economic structure that still controlled most of the South. In Beaufort, South Carolina, Robert Smalls was at the center of this economic activity. He co-founded the Enterprise Railroad, an 18-mile horse-drawn railway line connecting the Charleston wharves to inland depots. The railroad's board of directors was almost entirely black. He owned and published a newspaper, the Beaufort Southern Standard. He invested in real estate. He helped build a community that, for a brief time, was a model of what black economic independence could look like. This economic dimension of Reconstruction is crucial to understanding both its achievements and its destruction. The white planter class understood that economic independence and political independence were two sides of the same coin. A black man who owned his own business, who banked at a black-owned institution, who subscribed to a black-owned newspaper, was a black man who couldn't be economically coerced into supporting the Democratic ticket. And so, the destruction of black economic institutions was always part of the campaign to destroy black political power. Night riders burned black-owned businesses alongside black-owned churches. White merchants refused to do business with black political activists. Landowners evicted sharecroppers who voted Republican. Banks foreclosed on loans to black farmers who refused to support Democratic candidates. The economic warfare was as systematic as the political violence, and in many ways more effective, because it didn't require anyone to fire a gun. It just required the slow, relentless application of economic pressure until resistance became impossible. But that's getting ahead of the story, because before the end came, before redemption and Jim Crow and the long dark night of disenfranchisement, there was this moment, this extraordinary, improbable, beautiful moment, when formerly enslaved men walked into state houses and wrote laws and built schools and opened businesses and changed the South. And that moment deserves to be remembered not for how it ended, but for what it proved while it lasted. It proved that the idea of black inferiority, the idea that had justified slavery and segregation and 1,000 forms of cruelty, was and always had been a lie, not a misunderstanding, not a difference of opinion, a lie, told by people who knew it was a lie but found it profitable, and the men who disproved that lie, the first black politicians of the Reconstruction South, did so not by arguing but by governing, not by protesting but by producing. They showed up. They did the work. They left a record of achievement that speaks for itself. And the soldiers kept coming. Across the South, in every state that had once been part of the Confederacy, black men stepped into public life with an urgency that reflected how well they understood the fragility of the moment. They knew, even if they couldn't articulate it in exactly these terms, that the window was open and might not stay open long. And so they governed with the focus of people who had no time to waste. In Louisiana, Oscar Dunn became the first black lieutenant governor in American history in 1868, preceding Even Pinchback in that role. Dunn was a former enslaved man who had become a house painter, then a music teacher, then a Freedmen's Bureau agent, then a politician of remarkable integrity. He was known for his moral rigor, which made him both admired and inconvenient. He clashed with Louisiana's carpetbagger governor, Henry Clay Warmoth, over corruption and patronage. He advocated for honest government at a time when honest government was in short supply on all sides. He died suddenly in 1871, likely from a stroke, though rumors of poisoning followed him into the grave. He was 45 years old, and he had served as lieutenant governor for barely 3 years. But in those 3 years, he had proven that a formerly enslaved man could govern with competence and principle in one of the most politically treacherous states in the country. In Florida, Jonathan Gibbs served as Secretary of State and then Superintendent of Public Instruction, positions he used to build the state's public school system. Gibbs was a graduate of Dartmouth College and Princeton Theological Seminary, which made him one of the most educated men in any Florida government, before or since. He established teacher training programs, standardized curricula, and dramatically expanded enrollment for both black and white children. He died in 1874 at the age of 47, possibly from an epileptic seizure, though again whispers of poisoning circulated. The pattern is hard to ignore. Effective black politicians had a tendency to die young in the Reconstruction South, and the causes of death were often suspiciously convenient for the people who wanted them gone. In Alabama, James Rapier served in the United States House of Representatives and was one of the most eloquent advocates for the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Rapier was born free in Alabama to a prosperous mixed-race family and was educated in Canada. He returned to Alabama after the war and became a cotton planter and political organizer. In Congress, he spoke with searing honesty about the daily humiliations of being black in America. He described being unable to find lodging at inns while traveling between his district and Washington. He described being turned away from restaurants, hotels, and rail cars. He stood before his colleagues and asked them a question that still echoes today. How can you expect me to be proud of this country when this country is not proud of me? Rapier lost his seat in 1874, the victim of redistricting and democratic resurgence. He spent his last years as a tax collector and died in 1883 at the age of 45. His story is one of dozens that follow the same arc: rise, service, courage, defeat, and then erasure. Henry McNeill Turner of Georgia is another name that history books have been criminally negligent in mentioning. Turner was born free in South Carolina, ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and sent to Georgia in 1865 to build black congregations. He became the most effective political organizer in the state, registering thousands of black voters and building the Republican Party in Georgia virtually from scratch. He was elected to the Georgia legislature in 1868. And then, in September of 1868, the Georgia legislature expelled all of its black members. Read that again. The white legislators, through an alliance between Democrats and conservative Republicans, voted to expel every single black member of the legislature. Their reasoning was grotesque in its simplicity. They argued that while the 14th Amendment gave black men the right to vote, it did not explicitly give them the right to hold office. And therefore, they concluded, with the kind of legal reasoning that can only emerge from a profound commitment to injustice, black men had no right to sit in the legislature. Out, all of you. Turner's response was a speech that ranks among the great orations of American political history. He stood before the very men who had just voted to remove him and told them that he was there by the will of the people, that his rights came not from the generosity of white legislators, but from the Constitution of the United States, and that no amount of parliamentary trickery could change the fact that he had been duly elected. He would not beg for the seat, he said. He was not going to fawn or cringe. He was a man elected by men, and he would be treated as such. The black legislators, led by Turner, lobbied the federal government, and in 1870 they were reseated by order of Congress. But the damage was done. The message was clear. White Georgia was willing to use any mechanism, legal or otherwise, to prevent black political participation. And when the mechanism wasn't sufficient, there was always violence. 1/4 of Georgia's black legislators during Reconstruction were killed, threatened, beaten, or jailed. The Klan operated openly. Night riders burned homes and churches. Black politicians traveled armed, slept in shifts, and wrote their wills before attending legislative sessions. The courage required to persist under these conditions is difficult to fully grasp from the comfort of the present. These were men who had everything to lose, literally everything: their lives, their families, their property, and they kept showing up. They kept voting. They kept introducing legislation. They kept arguing for justice in rooms where half the occupants wanted them dead, and the other half was increasingly unwilling to stop it. Consider the economics of what they were fighting for, because the political struggle of Reconstruction was inseparable from the economic one. The entire Southern economy had been built on enslaved labor, Cotton, the crop that had made the South rich and driven the expansion of slavery across the continent, was worthless without someone to pick it. After emancipation, the planter class needed a new way to extract labor from black workers without paying them what they were worth. The answer was sharecropping, a system designed with the precision of a trap. Under sharecropping, a freedman would work a plot of land owned by a white landowner. He would provide the labor. The landowner would provide the land, the tools, and the seed. At the end of the harvest, the crop would be divided, usually 50-50, though in practice the split was almost always tilted in the landowner's favor. The landowner also ran the general store, where the sharecropper was required to buy supplies on credit, at inflated prices with interest. By the time the crop came in and the debts were settled, most sharecroppers found themselves owing more than they'd earned. They couldn't leave the land until the debt was paid. The debt was never paid. They were, for all practical purposes, re-enslaved. Black politicians understood this trap and fought against it. They advocated for land redistribution, for fair labor contracts, for access to credit outside the plantation store system. Robert Smalls championed the creation of the South Carolina Land Commission, which worked to get land into the hands of formerly enslaved people. The theory was simple and correct. Economic independence was the foundation of political independence. A man who owns his own land, who feeds his family from his own labor, who doesn't depend on the goodwill of the man who used to own him, is a man who can vote freely, speak freely, and live freely. The planters understood this too, which is why they fought land redistribution with the same ferocity they fought voting rights. The promise of 40 acres and a mule, famously attributed to General Sherman's Special Field Orders, number 15, was never fully implemented. Most of the land that had been redistributed to freed people during the war was returned to its former owners by President Andrew Johnson, who was as committed to white supremacy as he was incompetent at everything else. The failure to provide black Americans with an economic foundation for their freedom was, in many ways, the original sin of Reconstruction, the crack in the structure that eventually brought the whole thing down. But let's not give the failure of land reform all the credit. Reconstruction was not killed by a single cause. It was killed by a conspiracy of causes, some violent, some legal, some simply the result of Northern indifference. The Compromise of 1877, which resolved the disputed presidential election between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden, was the final stroke. In exchange for the presidency, Hayes agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South. Without troops, there was no enforcement. Without enforcement, there was no protection. And without protection, the gains of Reconstruction evaporated like morning dew in the Mississippi sun. State by state, the South was redeemed. Black voters were stripped of their rights through a combination of violence, fraud, and new constitutions specifically designed to exclude them. The men who had governed during Reconstruction were driven from office. The schools they had built were defunded or segregated. The laws they had written were repealed or ignored. The institutions they had created were dismantled. And the stories of their accomplishments were buried so deep that it took historians nearly a century to dig them back up. The closing of this chapter of American history was not a natural process. It was not the inevitable fading of an experiment that had run its course. It was murder. Vichy, let the grief of the ending consume thee. Let the grief of the ending consume the story. Let's return to what was built. Because the legacy of Reconstruction's black politicians extends far beyond the decade in which they served. The constitutions they wrote though eventually gutted, established principles that would be resurrected during the civil rights movement of the 20th century. The schools they founded became the seeds of historically black colleges and universities. The political organizations they created planted traditions of civic engagement that survived underground through decades of Jim Crow. And the example they set, the proof that black Americans could govern effectively, ethically, and in the interest of all citizens, could not be unlearned, no matter how hard the revisionists tried. When the civil rights movement erupted in the 1950s and 1960s, its leaders drew directly on the legacy of Reconstruction. The 14th and 15th Amendments, which Reconstruction politicians had fought to ratify and enforce, became the legal foundation for desegregation, voting rights, and equal protection under the law. Thurgood Marshall argued Brown versus Board of Education, using constitutional principles that Reconstruction politicians had embedded in the nation's founding documents. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was, in many ways, the fulfillment of a promise that Reconstruction's black politicians had made nearly a century earlier. And the men themselves, though largely forgotten for decades, are being remembered. Robert Smalls's story has been told in books, documentaries, and a forthcoming film. Joseph Rainey has a room named after him in the United States Capitol. Hiram Revel's portrait hangs in the Senate. PBS Pinchback's role in founding Southern University is part of Louisiana's institutional memory. Blanche Bruce's home in Washington is a National Historic Landmark. These are small gestures, insufficient compared to the magnitude of what these men accomplished, but they are gestures in the right direction. Let's circle back now to where we started, to that feeling in the air in 1868, that mixture of possibility and gunpowder. Because what the first black politicians of the South proved was not just that they could govern. They proved that democracy itself was possible. Real democracy, the kind that includes everyone, not just the people who look like the people who've always held power. They proved it could work, and the fact that it was destroyed doesn't prove that it couldn't. It only proves that there were people willing to destroy it. So let's spend some more time inside that world, because we owe it to them. Let's linger in the rooms where they worked, the streets where they walked, the chambers where they fought. Picture the South Carolina State House in Columbia in 1870. The building itself is still scarred from Sherman's march. Cannonball marks pock the exterior walls. The interior smells of fresh paint and old wood and tobacco smoke and something else, something you can't quite name. It's ambition. It's the smell of people who are building something for the first time in their lives, and they know it. The chamber is crowded, more crowded than it's ever been, because for the first time, the people sitting in these seats actually look like the state they represent. South Carolina's population is majority black, and its House of Representatives reflects that fact. Black men sit alongside white men, Republican carpetbaggers from the North, and a handful of white Southern Unionists who had opposed secession and were now labeled scalawags by their neighbors for the sin of believing that democracy should include everyone. You notice the clothing first. Some of the black legislators wear fine suits, tailored in Charleston, or ordered from Northern catalogs. These are men who came from the small free black elite, men who had been educated, who had owned property even before the war. Others wear suits that are newer, stiffer, the fabric still holding its factory creases, purchased with the first real wages they've ever earned. A few wear their Union Army uniforms because they've earned the right and because the uniform still commands respect from anyone who remembers which side won. The debates are lively, more lively than the decorum of the chamber technically allows. Men argue about school funding, about road construction, about tax policy. They argue about whether the state should provide relief to the poor, and if so, how much and for whom. They argue about land reform, about labor contracts, about the rights of women and children. And they argue about the thing that hovers over every discussion like a storm cloud: the violence, the night riders, the burning crosses, the assassinations. A man rises to speak. He's a minister from the Low Country, a former enslaved person who taught himself to read using the Bible and a stub of pencil. His voice carries the cadences of the pulpit, but his words are precise, loyally. He's arguing for funding for the state militia because the federal troops are thin on the ground and the Klan is thick in the upcountry. He knows that some of his colleagues, the white Democrats who still hold seats, will vote against him out of principle. He knows that others, nominally Republican, will vote against him out of cowardice. But he makes the argument anyway, because the alternative is silence. And silence in the face of organized murder is complicity. After the session, the legislators file out into the Columbia evening. The air is warm and heavy, carrying the scent of magnolia and wood smoke from the homes surrounding the State House grounds. Some of the men walk in groups, a precaution that has become habit. Others head to boarding houses where black legislators stay because the hotels in Columbia don't welcome them. They eat together, they talk strategy. They share intelligence about which roads are safe to travel and which have been claimed by men on horseback with torches and bad intentions. At one of these boarding houses, a group gathers around a long wooden table, still littered with the remnants of dinner: cornbread, beans, a pot of greens. Someone has produced a bottle of whiskey. The conversation turns, as it always does, to the question of how long this can last. Everyone in the room understands that they are living in borrowed time. The federal government's commitment to Reconstruction is wavering. Northern voters are losing interest. The Democratic press is relentless in its mockery and its calls for redemption. And the violence is getting worse, not better. But someone at the table, maybe the minister from the Low Country, maybe a young lawyer from Charleston, maybe a former field hand who now serves on the county commission, says something that cuts through the worry. He says that even if it all ends tomorrow, they will have proven something that can never be unproven. They will have shown that black men can govern, that they can write laws and build schools and run elections and manage budgets, that the entire mythology of black inferiority, the mythology that justified 2.5 centuries of slavery, is a lie. And once you prove a lie is a lie, you can't make it true again, no matter how many guns you have. The table goes quiet for a moment. Then someone nods. Someone else pours another drink. And the conversation turns to tomorrow's legislative calendar, because there's a bill about railroad easements that needs attention and a committee report on the state orphanage that's overdue. They go back to work, because that's what they do. They go back to work. This scene, or something very much like it, played out hundreds of times across the Reconstruction South, in every state house, in every county seat, in every small town where a black man had won election to the school board or the justice of the peace. The same dynamic held. Hope tempered by realism. Courage reinforced by community. Work done in the face of death. And the work they did was astonishing in its scope. Let's catalogue just some of what Reconstruction's black politicians accomplished, because the list itself is a rebuttal to every lie ever told about this period. They established public school systems in states that had never had them. Before Reconstruction, most southern states provided no free public education for anyone, black or white. The planter class, had always preferred private tutors for their own children and ignorance for everyone else. Reconstruction legislatures changed that, creating school systems funded by public taxes, staffed by trained teachers, and open to all children. In some states, black legislators pushed for integrated schools. In most, they settled for separate schools as a pragmatic compromise, understanding that any education was better than none. They reformed criminal justice. They abolished corporal punishment as a legal penalty. They ended the practice of debtor's prison. They created new courts and expanded access to legal representation. They wrote laws that, for the first time, recognized the testimony of black witnesses as legally valid. They invested in infrastructure, roads, bridges, railroads, public buildings. The South's physical infrastructure had been devastated by the war, and Reconstruction legislatures allocated funds to rebuild it. Much of this spending was criticized by Democrats as profligate, but the reality was that the South needed infrastructure and someone had to pay for it. They expanded democratic participation. They eliminated property requirements for voting and office holding. They created more elected positions and reduced the number of appointed ones. They made government more responsive to the people it served. They championed economic justice. They created land commissions to help formerly enslaved people acquire property. They wrote labor laws that provided some protection against exploitation. They taxed large land holdings more equitably, shifting the burden from the poor to the wealthy. And they did all of this in roughly a decade, while being shot at. The story of Reconstruction's black politicians is not a story of failure. It is a story of success cut short. It is a story of what was possible and what was lost. And the distance between those two things is the measure of a tragedy that this country has never fully reckoned with. There's another dimension to this story that deserves attention, and it's the personal dimension. These were not abstractions. They were people. They had families, worries, joys, and private lives that history has mostly overlooked. Blanche Bruce married Josephine Bill Wilson in 1878, a Cleveland socialite, in a wedding that generated national press coverage. They honeymooned in Europe for 4 months. Their son, Roscoe, was named for Bruce's mentor in the Senate. The family moved in Washington's highest social circles, black and white. Bruce was a man who had been born someone's property and who ended his life as one of the most prominent and respected figures in the nation's capital. Robert Smalls married Hannah Jones, the enslaved woman he had courted during his Charleston waterfront years, and they raised their children in the Beaufort house that had once belonged to his enslaver. When Hannah died in 1883, Smalls later remarried to a Charleston schoolteacher named Annie Wigg. He was, by all accounts, a devoted father and a generous neighbor. He let his former enslaver's widow live in what was now his house. That act alone tells you something about the caliber of person we're discussing. Joseph Rainey married Susan, a free woman of color from the West Indies, during his time in Philadelphia before the war. They had 3 children. After his congressional career ended, he tried to build a banking and brokerage business in Washington, but it failed. He spent his last years in Georgetown, South Carolina, where he had been born into slavery more than half a century earlier. He died at 55, worn out by a lifetime of struggle. These personal details matter because they restore humanity to men who have been reduced to footnotes. They ate breakfast. They worried about money. They argued with their spouses. They bounced their children on their knees. They laughed at jokes. They got tired. They got sick. They got old. And through all of it, they carried the burden of being first, of being the proof that an entire race was capable of self-governance. a burden that no person should have to carry, but that they carried with a grace that still astonishes. The world they moved through was a world of contrasts so extreme that the mind struggles to hold them simultaneously. On one hand, a black senator presiding over the United States Senate. On the other, a black farmer murdered for trying to vote. On one hand, a black legislator writing a public school law. On the other, a black school teacher beaten for teaching children to read. The promise and the backlash existed side by side, intertwined, each feeding the other, until the backlash finally overwhelmed the promise and the lights went out across the South for nearly a century. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillow and let the weight of the day slide off your shoulders, consider what these men did with the brief time they were given. Consider Hiram Revels walking into a Senate chamber where no black person had ever sat, taking the oath of office in a room that fell silent to witness something that half the country hoped for and the other half dreaded. Consider Blanche Bruce, born into slavery, presiding over the body that once debated whether he was fully human. Consider Robert Smalls, stealing a warship and then buying his enslaver's house, and then writing a state's first public school law. Consider PBS Pinchback, governing Louisiana with the swagger of a man who knew exactly what he was worth and refused to accept a penny less. Consider Joseph Rainey, standing on the House floor with death threats in his pocket, arguing for the rights of every citizen in the Republic. Consider the 2,000 black Americans who held public office during Reconstruction, the sheriffs and the tax collectors and the school board members and the justices of the peace, the men who ran for office knowing it might cost them their lives, the men who served knowing that the whole experiment might be swept away before their terms expired, the men who showed up anyway, every day, because the work mattered and the people they served mattered, and the principle behind it all, the idea that democracy means everyone, mattered most of all. They proved that systems of oppression, no matter how deeply rooted, are never as permanent as they pretend to be. They proved that people who have been told for centuries that they are incapable of greatness will, given the slightest opportunity, produce greatness that stuns the world. They proved that the distance between slavery and the Senate floor is exactly as far as one person's courage can carry them. And they did it knowing that the people who opposed them were willing to use every weapon available, from assassination to constitutional manipulation, to the slow erosion of public will, to take it all away. They did it anyway. They governed anyway. They built anyway. They fought anyway. So as you lie here tonight, safe and warm, in a world that is imperfect, but incomparably freer than the one these men inhabited, whisper a quiet thank you to the Reconstruction politicians who changed the South. They didn't do it for glory. Most of them died in obscurity. They didn't do it for money. Most of them died poor. They did it because they believed, with a conviction that no amount of violence could extinguish that the promise of America was worth fighting for. That the words written in the Constitution were not just words, but obligations. That a country built on the labor of enslaved people owed those people more than freedom. It owed them a seat at the table. They sat at that table, briefly, imperfectly, magnificently, and when they were driven from it, they left behind a record of achievement that stands as one of the most remarkable chapters in American history. A chapter that was hidden for generations. A chapter that we are only now beginning to read. The Reconstruction era was not a footnote. It was a revolution. And the first black politicians who led that revolution were not footnotes either. They were the architects of a democracy that the rest of the country is still trying to build. Close your eyes now. Let the names settle into your memory. Hiram Revels, Blanche Bruce, Robert Smalls, PBS Pinchback, Joseph Rainey, John Roy Lynch, Robert Brown Elliott, Henry McNeil Turner, Oscar Dunn, Jonathan Gibbs, James Rapier, and the hundreds, the thousands, whose names we may never know, but whose work echoes in every election, every school, every courtroom where the promise of equal justice is honored. They ran so that you could rest. They fought so that their descendants might live without fighting. They spoke so that silence would never again be the only option. Rest now, sleep well, and remember them.